My name is Kathleen Marden, and I am the niece of Betty and Barney Hill. I am also an independent researcher, and I'm associated with Mutual UFO Network as their Director of Experiencer Research, and the Edgar Mitchell Foundation for Research into Extraterrestrial Encounters. I'm on the board of directors, and I'm a research associate there as well. But I'm primarily an independent investigator and researcher and the author of 4 books, co-author of 4. And I was 13 years old when Betty Hill phoned my mother. My mother was Betty's younger sister, and she and my Uncle Barney had been on a brief vacation to Niagara Falls. They returned home through Montreal and through the White Mountains of New Hampshire to their home on the seacoast of New Hampshire, it's just a 17-mile seacoast, and they lived in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And the previous evening, as they were returning home, Betty told my mother that she and Barney had seen a flying saucer, and they'd seen it very, very close. It was so close to them that they were concerned they might have been exposed to radiation, and they wanted to know what to do. They had taken very long showers. They had left their clothing out on the back porch. They had food with them, and they left their food in a cooler, and they were going to throw that away. They were very concerned. We had a neighbor who was a physicist, and my mother called the physicist. And for some reason, he said that if Betty had a compass, she should take it out to the car to see how the needle of the compass reacted to the car. Well, she did. And the compass needle would spin and spin, indicating that there were counter-rotating magnetic fields on the trunk of that vehicle. We have seen that in other cases of close contact with UFOs and abductions. As the story unfolded over the next couple of days, my family and I drove to Portsmouth, New Hampshire. I had 2 younger brothers, mother and father, to Betty and Barney's home, and I was able to hear the story firsthand. Then I saw the spots on the trunk of the car. What I found out is that Betty and Barney had a sighting that lasted for probably about an hour. This UFO came in closer and closer as they drove along. They stopped a couple of times to look at it. And at one point, it swooped down so low that they thought it was maybe 100 feet off the ground. And Barney stepped out of the car. He left the car running. Betty was seated in the passenger seat. He looked up through binoculars at this craft, and he saw lighted windows. And behind those windows, he saw figures looking down at him. It moved to an adjacent field, and he followed the craft into the field, and it descended even lower. As he was looking, all but one of those figures that he described as being somehow non-human, but dressed in shiny black uniforms, all but one moved away from the windows and went to a panel on the back side of this corridor. And when they did, he could see them from their knees all the way to the tops of their heads. He saw their arms go up into the air, and when that happened, fin-like structures started to come out of the sides of this craft. There were red lights on the ends of these fins, and the UFO tipped toward him and started to descend lower. Something started to drop down out of the bottom of this craft. He was greatly distressed and frightened, thinking that they were going to capture him. He ran back to the car, screaming to Betty they had to get out of there or they were going to be captured. And as he was running back, he saw this craft move again. He believed it was going to be over the top of the car. So as he went speeding down the highway, he said to Betty, "Roll down your window and look up. See if you can see them." She did. She was expecting to see lights. She didn't see the lights on the craft All she saw was blackness. And then she and Barney heard a series of code-like buzzing sounds that appeared to be striking the trunk of their vehicle in the area where they found these counter-rotating magnetic fields, where their compass needles would spin and spin the following day. And then something happened. They felt a vibration in their vehicle. They felt a tingling sensation pass through their bodies. And the next thing they knew, they were 35 miles down the highway with almost no memory of what had happened in the interim. They remembered that somewhere along the way they encountered a roadblock. They didn't know where or when that occurred. They had a need for human contact. They wanted to find the state police or any patrolman who might be out so they could report this immediately. They heard a second series of buzzing sounds on the trunk of the car. At that point, Barney stopped the car. He shifted the car from side to side on the road, trying to reproduce that sound. He could not do that. Betty looked up again. She didn't see a UFO that time. They drove home, and when they arrived home, it was a couple of hours later than they had anticipated, and that is when they found evidence that something extraordinary had happened to them, something they couldn't remember. Betty's dress was torn in several locations. There was a 2-inch tear in the stitching on the zipper at the back of her dress. There was a 1-inch tear in the thick zipper fabric. Her hem was torn down on one side. The lining of her dress was torn from waist to hemline. Barney's best dress shoes, and he was a meticulous dresser, his best dress shoes were so deeply scraped he had to go out and buy new shoes and wore them for yard work after that. The binocular strap that he had around his neck as he was standing in that field had broken. It was a leather strap, and it was severed, as I imagine, because he pulled those binoculars down from his eyes so violently as he was attempting to escape from the eyes of that individual who was standing at the window looking down at him, who so greatly frightened him. The watches they were wearing that night had stopped and never ran again. There was a lot of evidence that something very perplexing had happened, but they had no memory for what had happened during that 2-hour period of missing time. They remembered the UFO. Barney remembered observing the non-humans on board that craft. They remembered the second series of buzzing sounds. It's all in the early reports that they made to the Air Force, Project Blue Book, and also to NICAP. But Barney left out the part about observing non-humans on the craft because he was afraid of ridicule. He thought the Air Force would think he was crazy. So he left that out. But he didn't leave that out when he made the report to the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena. And they found that committee because Betty checked the first book she had ever read on that subject out of the Portsmouth Public Library a couple of days after they arrived home. And she read that book, and the address was in that book. And that's why she and Barney wrote their letter and their report to NICAP. It was an incredible story. They underwent hypnosis a couple of years later. And initially, they wanted Barney to undergo hypnosis because he knew those figures were somehow not human. He could describe the uniform. He even could describe a facial expression. But he did not remember all the details of their faces. And they had that period of missing time. And they thought that he developed a mental block after he had observed those non-humans and felt so threatened by them. And it took them a couple of years to find a psychiatrist, a renowned psychiatrist, in fact, who was highly competent in using deep trance hypnosis in order to help people to overcome psychosomatic symptoms that they were experiencing as the result of an intense emotional experience. Dr. Benjamin Simon had had a great deal of success in working with veterans returning from World War II who couldn't go back into society because their experiences in the war were so traumatic that they might have been blinded even though there wasn't a physiological reason for that blinding, or they might have been crippled and unable to walk because of the psychological effect of the experience they had. Dr. Simon said that Barney's trauma was as great as any shell shock victim that he ever treated. Barney feared for his death, for his life. This was an experience that was very traumatic for him. And Dr. Simon worked with both Barney and Betty separately for a period of 6 months. He hypnotized each of them and he did therapy with each of them. He induced amnesia at the end of each of their individual sessions for 2 reasons. One reason was the trauma was so great that it could have caused further emotional damage to them, particularly to Barney, if they remembered all of that at one time. And for the second reason, it was because he didn't want them to share the details of their experience with one another. And that is very important because I was able to compare their separate statements to Dr. Simon, line up those statements for comparative analysis to discover whether Betty's and Barney's statements correlated in detail. And I found out that they did, and I also compared those statements to 5 dreams that Betty had had and had written down in 1961. And what I found was that Betty's and Barney's statements about what happened on that craft and as they were abducted matched, but they did not match Betty's dream material in detail in all cases. So that led me to believe that this was indeed a true experience. And there was a tremendous amount of physical evidence as well that has been investigated scientifically. Chemical analysis has been done on Betty's dress with anomalous findings in 5 different laboratories. There's a tremendous amount of physical evidence here. Betty and Barney were credible individuals. She was a social worker for the state of New Hampshire. He had served honorably in the Army during World War II. His release papers say that he was of excellent character. They were church-going people. They were very involved in community affairs. In fact, in 1965, Barney was appointed to the U.S. Civil Rights Commission State Advisory Committee in the state of New Hampshire. He was also given a commendation by Sergeant Shriver for the good work he had done in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, through the Office of Economic Opportunity, setting up the Rockingham County Community Action Program, and he was the first chairman of the board of directors for that committee. And Betty worked at his side. They worked as a couple together, doing these good things for the people of this country. In the civil rights movement, they were an interracial couple. And for the people of New Hampshire. They worked on voters' rights during the time when people had to pass a literacy test in order to vote. And they worked on that literacy program so that everyone who wanted to vote would have that opportunity. The 3 of us were invited guests at Lyndon Johnson's inauguration, and we went to that inauguration together. So what I'm saying is they were credible. There was scientific evidence. There was missing time. These were not emotionally unstable individuals. It was only the experience itself. No one that we knew of had had that experience before them. They feared for their life when this occurred. And that is what led to the trauma they experienced. But after that, and after their treatment with Dr. Simon, they went on and they were highly productive in their work. The question that many people have asked is, did being an interracial couple make this more difficult for them? And I believe that in a sense it did. Betty and Barney were very active in the civil rights movement. As I said, they were very strong individuals. They never wanted this story to go public. They spoke to the family about it, their friends, they spoke to people at their church, they spoke to UFO investigators, they spoke to scientists about their experience. They were perplexed. They wanted to know what happened. They wanted to learn more about this. But it went public through a violation of confidentiality in 1965. And when that happened, we met as a family and we discussed what we should do, how they should proceed from here. And we agreed that since the articles that were in the Boston Traveler for 5 days in a row about their experience were not entirely accurate, and since the cat was out of the bag, that they should go public. And so they did at that point, and they allowed a book to be written about their experience as well. They were afraid they would lose their jobs, they would lose their credibility. They kept their jobs. Their supervisors were questioned, were interviewed, and they spoke up for Betty and Barney and talked about what good, honest people they were, how hard-working they were. Betty's supervisor said that he wished he had 6 more people just like her. So it didn't affect them in that sense, but there were detractors who thought that they somehow wanted to bring attention to themselves because they were an interracial couple. That certainly is not something that an interracially married couple in 1961 and when it went public in 1966 would want to happen. They didn't want anything to reduce their credibility. And then, of course, there were debunkers, there were disinformants who came along, who attempted to destroy Betty's and Barney's lives, who disinformed the public about what actually did happen and about this story, about Betty's and Barney's character, and about the kind of people they were. And that's why I speak up today. I have the documented evidence if anyone is interested in seeing that. Some of these references are in my book with Stanton Friedman, Captured: The Betty and Barney Hill UFO Experience. And you can go to my website at Kathleen-Marden, MARDEN.com, and there's a lot of information there about Betty's and Barney's case, and I would be happy to show these documents to individuals who would like to see them. It is true. The documented evidence is there. Well, I know that everybody probably wants to know what was revealed under hypnosis, these separate hypnosis sessions with Dr. Benjamin Simon. He began with Betty and Barney separately with the beginning of their trip. And he asked each of them to recount what happened at every step along that trip, where they stayed, what they saw, how much time they spent at every stop they made. And then he led both of them separately up to the point of the sighting, also through the sighting that I have already told you about, and then to the point of what happened after that UFO was hovering above their vehicle and they heard these buzzing sounds striking the trunk of the car. That period of missing time. Betty and Barney each paused during the hypnosis sessions, and they seemed a little confused. And then they each said, separately, "We're in a different location. There are tall trees all around. We don't know where we are. And then they found themselves turning onto a dirt road. They were in the middle of nowhere. There were tall trees all around, and there was a light up ahead, a red glowing light. And then they saw figures in the road. And they had a discussion about what those figures were. Is there an accident ahead? Is this a robbery? They didn't know. But then those figures started to approach them, and Barney said, "Betty, it's the ones I saw in the field." And she became terrified. She went to open the car door. She was going to run into the woods and hide. But they intercepted her before she could do that. And she lost consciousness at that point. Barney opened his car door. He stepped out. He had a pistol. He thought about going for it, but he was afraid he would be harmed. He and Betty were taken down a dirt path through the woods. This is when Barney said that he could feel the toes of his shoes bumping along the pebbles along that path. He felt as if he were floating, as if his arms were outstretched and only the toes of his shoes were touching the ground. And he could then feel the toes of his shoes slide up what he thought was a ramp. And they bumped at the top of this ramp as if it were elevated. And then he was taken into an examining room. He was able to open his eyes at that point, and he was placed on a table, and there was a period of waiting for him as he was lying on that table. Betty said that she regained consciousness as she was being taken down this path, and as she was being escorted by two of these non-human entities who were pretty short. They were what we think of as little grays. They had large heads, small bodies. They were trying to take her up this ramp, and she fought for her life. She didn't know if she was going to be experimented on, if she was going to be killed, if she was going to be taken to some distant planet and exhibited in a zoo. She didn't know what was going to happen to her. She fought for her life, and she kicked one of those small entities, and that is when her dress was torn at the hem and the lining of the dress. They regained control of her. They took her up this ramp and into a separate examining room. They placed her in what was sort of like a dentist chair at first, or like a chaise lounge, and they examined her skin. They did the same thing to Barney. They were very interested in their skeletal structure, in their joints, in their nervous system. Betty and Barney thought that they were attempting to determine the differences between humans and themselves. Betty was then placed on a table. Her dress was removed first. She was still dressed in her slip and her underwear. The slip was pushed up, and the one that she called the examiner produced a large needle. And she became terrified. She said, "What are you going to do with that?" And he said, "Oh, it's only a simple test. We're going to put it into your navel." And all of this communication was telepathic. They understood these individuals in English with an accent. And the examiner said to Betty, "Oh, it won't hurt. We're only going to insert it into your navel." And she said, "Don't do it. Don't do it. It's going to hurt." And he thrust it into her navel anyway. And it caused such a degree of trauma for her, so much pain, that Dr. Simon had to end the session early. But the leader, who was standing by her head, did something in the area of her temple or her eyes. He saw his hand, and at this point, all of the pain went away. I've heard this over and over again in the experiencers that I have interviewed, and I've interviewed over 1,000. This has happened when pain is inflicted I wish it wasn't inflicted at all, but when this occurs, it is taken away nearly immediately. At this point, she started to trust this leader. She was able to get dressed again. The examiner went in to examine Barney, and she was left alone in the room with this leader. At this point, she said, "I know you're not from around here. Where are you from? Where's your home port?" And he produced this three-dimensional star map. There are about 16 stars on this map. They were different colors and different sizes, and he was able to show her some that were connected by solid lines. There were two as large as nickels in the foreground of that map. There were others that were the size of pinpoints, or maybe the head of a pin, and others that were only dots. And some were connected by solid lines, meaning that these were places that they traveled to on a regular basis. There were others that were only expeditions, connected by dotted lines. Dr. Simon gave Betty the post-hypnotic suggestion that if she could remember this, and she could remember it accurately without causing her too many emotional problems, then she would be able to go home and sketch it. And she did sketch it. It was later examined by Marjorie Fish, who was a brilliant woman from Ohio. And Marjorie was a school teacher, an amateur astronomer. She was a member of Mensa, meaning that she had a genius IQ. She went to the local university and she copied distance data from astronomical catalogs. We didn't have Xerox machines then. We didn't have computers that she could refer to. It's much easier today. But she took that distance data home and she began to construct three-dimensional models of the star system that Betty had sketched. And she went out 55 light years. In all, she ended up constructing 26 of these models. She went to a tremendous effort. And imagine the work she did mathematically to figure out where to put every one of these stars in its proper location on this map. And in 1972, she still had not identified that star system. Initially, she thought it would be very easy. It wasn't. And it ended up being quite frustrating, but she continued on building these models, changing these stars in location as new distance data was released. And in the end, in 1972, a new astronomical catalog was released. She changed some of these stars, and she had a match for the map that Betty had drawn. This is where my colleague Stanton Friedman came in, because he was asked to meet with Marjorie. He was impressed with her intelligence, with her commitment to her accuracy, and he was able to find astronomers who were able to vet her work, and they discovered that her work was accurate, that these two stars in the foreground were the Zeta Reticuli star system, Zeta Reticuli 1 and Zeta Reticuli 2, located in the southern hemisphere. You can only see them from the southern hemisphere of this Earth. The Earth, or our sun, was also on this map, and the other star systems were on this map as well. And what they discovered was that all of the stars on Betty's map were believed to be sun-like stars at that period in time, and only 5% of the stars in our local galactic neighborhood were sun-like. So this was extraordinary. The chance of this happening merely by chance was estimated to be anywhere from 1 in 10,000 to 1 in a million. And so many scientists began to believe that this was true based upon the star map, which was very controversial. Other scientists believed it was true because of the degree of evidence and the examination of that other evidence. Betty was also shown symbols on that craft in what appeared to be a tablet of what we think of today in the way she described it to me. In the year 2000, I asked her to sketch those symbols from memory. After those symbols were published in my book, Captured, the Betty and Barney Hill UFO Experience, in 2007, Dr. Don C. Donderi from McGill University did a symbol study with Stuart Appel from the State University of New York at Brockport. They used symbols that Bud Hopkins, the famous UFO abduction researcher Bud Hopkins, experiencers had sketched under hypnosis. And they used two control groups of graduate students who hadn't had UFO abductions. And then they compared these symbols, and they determined that the symbols drawn by Bud Hopkins experiencers were very similar, very much alike, and very different from the symbols drawn by both of these groups of graduate students. Then Dr. Donderi compared those to Betty's symbols that he saw in my book in 2007. And he made the statement that Betty's symbols were nearly identical to the symbols drawn by Bud Hopkins experiencers dating all the way back to 1975. So there is additional evidence that this was a real experience.